Welcome to True Crime Sketches. Today we dive into the chilling secrets behind what seemed like the perfect family. The story of the Bennetts from Springfield is more than just a family tragedy. It's a tale of forbidden love, murder, and the madness that consumed an entire town. What really happened in the house where peace and prosperity once thrived? How did two seemingly happy teenagers descend into darkness? Get ready, because this is one of the most disturbing and shocking stories you'll ever hear. Springfield, Vermont, was a town that seemed to have leapt straight from the pages of an old postcard, frozen in time. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved to each other from their front porches, where the days blurred together like the gentle hum of summer crickets, a town cocooned in the essence of the American dream. White picket fences outlined homes with pristine lawns, each house whispering tales of generations gone by, holding on to an ideal that felt perhaps a little too perfect. On one of the most prestigious streets in this idyllic town stood the Bennett family home. A symbol of their stature, its brick facade and manicured garden reflected a family seemingly untouched by the troubles of the world. Robert Bennett, the patriarch, was the very embodiment of determination and success. 50 years old, he had built his construction company from the ground up, brick by brick, transforming it into the most successful business in the county. His word was his bond, and his reputation as a man of integrity made him not only prosperous but revered, even feared in some circles. Sarah Bennett, his wife, complemented his resolve with a softer strength. At 48, she was a beloved figure in the community, her gentle spirit shining in her work as a local school teacher. Her ability to connect with every student, no matter how difficult or withdrawn, earned her a place in the hearts of many. At home, she was the quiet glue that held everything together, the warmth in the hearth, the soothing presence that made the Bennett household a sanctuary of peace. Then there were their children, Thomas 18 and Emily 16. From the outside, they seemed like the epitome of well-raised, well-rounded teenagers. Thomas, with his athletic build and calm demeanor, was preparing to head off to college, following in his father's footsteps in business. Emily, the artistic one, spent hours alone in her room, her brushstrokes capturing the tumult of emotion she preferred not to speak aloud. She dreamed of becoming an artist, her canvases a secret world where feelings could flow freely, far from the scrutinizing eyes of Springfield. But beneath the glossy veneer of this perfect family, there was a secret, a shadow that lurked, waiting to tear apart everything that seemed so flawlessly constructed. It was a secret that neither Robert nor Sarah could have imagined, one that took root quietly like a weed in a well-kept garden. Thomas and Emily, inseparable since childhood, had always shared a bond. In the beginning, it was innocent, a connection forged by sibling love. But as the years passed, that bond began to change, darken. Thomas, once the dependable older brother, started to see Emily in a way he couldn't understand, couldn't control. His feelings for her shifted, and the once clear lines between familial affection and something else, something forbidden, began to blur. He tried to drown it out with school, with sports, with anything that would keep him away from the uncomfortable truths of his own mind. But the more he fought it, the more it consumed him. Emily noticed the change too. The distance that had grown between them confused her, unsettled her. She couldn't comprehend why Thomas had become so distant, why his once warm gaze now held something she couldn't quite name. Yet in moments of quiet introspection, she found herself wrestling with feelings that seemed out of place, even dangerous. In her art, she hid these emotions behind layers of symbols and metaphors, painting scenes that only she could decode. Scenes where her confusion and secret desires were buried beneath vibrant colors and abstract shapes. Their once innocent connection had twisted into something darker, something neither of them could speak aloud. They sought out moments to be alone, even though being together filled them both with a sense of dread. The tension grew between them, a silent storm building under the surface, threatening to break apart the very foundation of their lives. They told themselves no one knew, that they were keeping their secret safe, hidden from the world. But in a town like Springfield, eyes were always watching. Whispers had already begun to swirl. The evenings, once filled with the comforting hum of their parents' lives in the next room, became moments laden with a tension that neither Thomas nor Emily could escape. When Robert and Sarah were preoccupied, perhaps at town meetings or charity events, the siblings would find themselves alone, drawn to each other in a way they could not fully comprehend. What started as fleeting moments of stolen glances soon turned into hushed conversations and shared silences that were both suffocating and intoxicating. Each time they met, they edged closer to a precipice, unable to confess their forbidden feelings. yet incapable of severing the bond that held them fast. It was a paradox they couldn't resolve, a tangled web of emotions, frightening yet magnetic, slowly tearing them apart from within. They were sinking deeper each day into a darkness neither of them had anticipated, unable to see the catastrophic consequences lying just ahead. By May 2023, their secret had grown too large to contain within the walls of their home. They began slipping away to places where prying eyes couldn't reach them, secluded spots in the woods, far from town, where the trees whispered secrets of their own. The further they ventured, the more they felt the weight of inevitability. They told themselves they were just trying to figure things out, to make sense of the storm of emotions they could no longer ignore. But deep down, they both knew they had passed a point of no return. Thomas, always the more composed of the two, struggled with his conscience. His mind spun through potential escapes, leaving town, running away to college, anything to break the chains of his obsession. But no matter how hard he tried to distance himself, his thoughts always circled back to Emily, as if she were not just his sister but his fate. He could feel the pull of her presence, an invisible tether that kept drawing him closer, and it terrified him. June 2023 was the month Emily reached her breaking point. The confusion, the guilt, the growing weight of her emotions, all of it became too much. She turned to her only refuge, a diary. In those pages she poured out the feelings she couldn't voice, the love that both haunted and consumed her. She wrote about the nights they spent in the woods, the moments where their connection felt like the only real thing in her life. But in writing, Emily unknowingly added another thread to the web of their undoing. The diary, hidden carefully under her pillow, became a silent witness to everything they had tried to keep buried. July 2023. The heat of summer hung heavy in the air, thick and oppressive, mirroring the tension between Thomas and Emily. Their secret meetings continued, but the pressure was becoming unbearable. The careful facade they had maintained, of being nothing more than siblings, of being a normal family, was beginning to crack. That was when Detective Julia Harper entered their lives. A sharp, intuitive woman, Harper had spent years honing her instincts, and something about the Bennett family didn't sit right with her. Thomas and Emily's behavior had caught her attention, and while no one else seemed to notice the strangeness in their interactions, Harper's gut told her otherwise. Something darker, she suspected, lurked beneath the polished surface of this perfect family. Harper began her own quiet investigation, observing the Bennetts from a distance, piecing together clues from their subtle shifts in behavior. She couldn't yet see the whole picture, but she knew a tragedy was brewing, one that could shatter the town's illusions of the Bennett family's perfection. The summer of 2023 would be a turning point, a slow unraveling of everything Thomas and Emily had held together for so long. As the days grew longer and hotter, the weight of their secret bore down on them. Emily, once so vibrant and full of life, began to retreat into herself. Guilt gnawed at her relentlessly, a constant creeping shadow that whispered the same question over and over. How did we let it come to this? She feared facing her parents, terrified they would see the truth in her eyes, that they would somehow know the terrible secret she carried. Nights became her personal torment. Emily would wake drenched in sweat, heart racing from nightmares where she and Thomas stood on the edge of a vast black abyss, teetering on the brink of destruction. Each morning the fear lingered, clawing at her insides, turning her further inward. She stopped seeing her friends, abandoning the easy laughter and carefree days of her past. She even stopped painting, unable to channel her emotions into art the way she once had. It was as though her soul had been drained, leaving behind a hollow shell of the girl she used to be. And Thomas? He too was unraveling. The weight of their secret had become too much for even him to bear, the strain visible in the tension of his jaw, the distant look in his eyes. Each encounter with Emily felt like a step closer to an inevitable disaster, yet he couldn't stop himself from seeking her out, from meeting her in those hidden places where, for a brief moment, they could forget the world around them. But the world had not forgotten them. Eyes were watching, and the truth, no matter how deeply buried, was about to come to light. At school, Emily's decline became painfully obvious. Once an enthusiastic student, she now drifted through her days like a ghost, her once bright spark dulled to a dim ember. Her teachers were the first to notice. Her grades slipped, her participation vanished, and she seemed perpetually lost in thought, as if trapped in some distant, unreachable place. Gone was the cheerful girl who had once lit up the classroom with her infectious energy. Now Emily appeared disconnected from reality itself, a shadow of her former self. Thomas, on the other hand, tried harder to keep up appearances, but his effort was a thin mask, and behind it his inner turmoil raged like a storm. The more he tried to suppress his feelings, the more they consumed him. Irritability crept into his every interaction, small frustrations boiling over into bursts of aggression that shocked even him. He found himself avoiding his father, Robert, as much as possible, terrified that somehow his father would see the truth in his eyes, the truth that his bond with Emily was not just wrong, but something darker, something forbidden and destructive. He spent long stretches of time alone, wandering aimlessly through the town, trying to drown out the voices in his head. Those voices condemned him for everything he had done, for every moment spent alone with Emily, for every forbidden thought that crossed his mind. The walks grew longer, but no distance could silence the growing chaos in his head. He feared the darkness within him, afraid of where it might lead, terrified of what he might eventually do. Meanwhile, life around the Bennetts continued, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension tearing the family apart. But not everyone was blind to it. Gary, the Bennett's neighbor and the owner of a small cafe, had always been a keen observer of people. He had known the Bennetts for years, and his friendship with Robert gave him insight into the family's routines and habits. For years, Gary had admired the Bennetts' closeness, their seemingly perfect lives. But recently, something had shifted. Gary had begun to sense a disturbance, a change in Thomas and Emily that he couldn't quite put his finger on. It started with something small. He had noticed Thomas and Emily leaving the house late one evening, walking toward the woods on the outskirts of town. The woods were a lonely, quiet place, rarely visited by anyone after dark. Gary found it strange that the siblings would choose such a secluded spot, especially at that hour. At first he dismissed it. Teenagers often crave solitude or adventure, but the unease in his chest lingered. And as these late-night walks became more frequent, Gary's concern deepened. One evening, as Gary was closing his cafe, he happened to glance out the window and spotted Thomas and Emily again. This time, they were sitting by the river, their postures tense, their conversation hushed and urgent. Something about the way they were talking, heads close together, eyes darting nervously around, sent a chill down Gary's spine. He decided to approach them, intending to casually say hello. But as soon as they saw him coming, they abruptly stood and left, walking away quickly as if caught doing something they shouldn't. Gary's unease turned into full-blown suspicion. It was more than just youthful rebellion, more than the usual teenage desire for privacy. The secrecy, the tension, it all pointed to something deeper, something darker. Gary wasn't one to panic easily, but the more he observed, the more troubled he became. He began to keep an eye on the siblings whenever he could, watching for any further signs of odd behavior. And each time he saw them leave the house, his concern grew. The secret meetings became more frequent, and always in places where no one else could see them. The paranoia began to take root in Gary's mind, his imagination running wild with possibilities. He wrestled with himself, unsure of what to do. Should he tell Robert? Should he share his suspicions? Or would that only make things worse? His own anxiety began to spiral. What if he was wrong? But the gut feeling gnawed at him, refusing to let go. Every interaction with the Bennett family now felt loaded, as if something terrible was bubbling just beneath the surface of their peaceful facade. The once idyllic town, where everything seemed so calm and predictable, was now the setting for Gary's mounting nightmare. By August 2023, Thomas and Emily were spending nearly every moment they could together, retreating deeper and deeper into the woods, as if the trees could hide them from the truth of what was happening. They knew their bond was spiraling out of control, that it had become dangerous, but they couldn't stop. They were drawn to each other, like moths to a flame, knowing the fire would consume them, but unable to resist. Gary, on the other hand, was consumed by his own growing fears. It was no longer just a matter of concern. He was convinced now that something much darker lay at the heart of Thomas and Emily's secret. He began to watch them obsessively, noting the odd times they would disappear, the strange hushed tones of their conversations, the way they avoided people. His mind began to piece together a story that he couldn't quite articulate, but one that filled him with dread. He felt trapped, unsure of what to do, but knowing that whatever Thomas and Emily were hiding, it was bigger than just youthful mischief. And as the summer dragged on, the once peaceful streets of Springfield began to feel suffocating, the weight of unspoken secrets pressing down on everyone who lived there, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally, inevitably, be exposed. By September 2023, Gary could no longer ignore the weight of his suspicions. The unease had settled into his bones, refusing to let go, and he realized he had to take action. He reached out to Detective Julia Harper, detailing the strange behavior he'd observed between Thomas and Emily. The late-night walks, the secretive conversations, the unsettling tension, it all painted a picture that Gary couldn't fully comprehend but felt was dangerous. Julia, who had already harbored her own doubts about the Bennett family, was not surprised. She had sensed something was off, but with Gary's observations, her suspicions deepened. Julia knew they were running out of time. Whatever was brewing in the Bennett household was building toward something inevitable, something irreversible. She launched an official investigation, discreet at first, not wanting to alarm the family or alert Thomas and Emily. But the cracks had already started to show, and their carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. The secret that had bound them together for so long was now threatening to break them apart, and in doing so, destroy everything they knew. By the fall of 2023, the emotional strain had reached a boiling point for Thomas and Emily. Their lives, once so controlled and contained, began to spiral out of control. Emily, overwhelmed by guilt and confusion over her feelings toward her brother, tried to distance herself from him in a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. She began reaching out to classmates, seeking connections that could distract her from the torment within. She forced herself to smile, to laugh at jokes, to pretend like nothing was wrong. But deep down, the constant fear gnawed at her. The fear that everyone could see through her facade, that at any moment her secret would be exposed. Her attempts at rebuilding a social life faltered. Each new interaction felt hollow, every conversation strained. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was living on borrowed time, that the truth was bubbling just beneath the surface of her carefully crafted smile. The pressure destroyed any chance of forming genuine relationships. Emily even attempted to start a relationship with Jason, a boy from her class. He was kind, patient, and genuinely interested in her. But no matter how hard she tried, her thoughts always drifted back to Thomas. Their time together was awkward, filled with long silences, and her inner turmoil barely contained beneath the surface. After a few uncomfortable encounters, she pushed Jason away completely, retreating back into her isolation. The walls around her were closing in, and there was no escape. Meanwhile, Thomas was spiraling down an even darker path. He had noticed Emily's attempts to distance herself from him, and it filled him with a sense of panic. His obsession with his sister, once hidden behind a veneer of brotherly affection, had now consumed him entirely. The idea of her moving on, living a life without him, became unbearable. In his mind, their connection was something beyond the ordinary, something sacred that no one else could understand or threaten. It was all that mattered to him, and he couldn't stand the thought of losing it. His possessiveness grew with each passing day. Thomas began to notice every interaction Emily had with others, particularly with boys. Each conversation she shared with another guy, even if it was harmless, sent him into a spiral of jealousy. His jealousy morphed into rage, a violent storm brewing within him that he struggled to keep in check. He started having outbursts, lashing out at Emily whenever he saw her with anyone else. The mere thought of her forming any connection outside of their bond was enough to send him over the edge. Emily, desperately trying to reclaim her independence, attempted to explain to Thomas that she needed space, that she wanted to live like any other girl her age. She wanted to have friends, to explore relationships, to figure out who she was outside of the tangled mess that had become their lives. But Thomas couldn't or wouldn't hear her. His obsession had crossed a line, and now it had morphed into something darker, more dangerous. As Emily tried to pull away, Thomas's behavior shifted from desperation to manipulation. He began to play on her guilt, reminding her of the bond they had shared, insisting that no one would ever understand them the way they understood each other. He painted their relationship as something pure, something unique that the outside world would never accept. Thomas convinced himself and tried to convince Emily that they could never survive without each other. His words were honeyed with the poison of manipulation, trapping Emily in a web of emotional blackmail. He would tell her that she was the only one who truly mattered to him, that their bond was the only thing that gave his life meaning. He warned her that no one else could ever comprehend what they had, that if she left him, she would be lost, just as he would be. Slowly, he was closing off any avenue of escape for her, binding her to him in ways that left her feeling suffocated and powerless. The tension between them reached a fever pitch. Their once secret world was now a prison, and neither of them knew how to break free. As the fall days grew shorter, the shadows in their lives only deepened, and the storm they had tried so hard to keep at bay was now crashing toward them, unstoppable and unforgiving. The truth, long buried, was about to come roaring to the surface, and with it, the fragile illusion of their perfect lives would be shattered forever. By October 2023, the situation had spiraled entirely out of control. Thomas's manipulation of Emily had grown more insidious, feeding her the same poisonous narrative over and over, that their love was something beyond the comprehension of anyone else, that it was special, untouchable. He painted a world in which they could only survive by being together, shutting out everyone who might try to separate them. He even began to talk of running away, of leaving behind their family, their town, their entire lives. For Emily, these conversations became a waking nightmare, the walls closing in around her. She realized with a sickening dread that her brother was no longer the person she had known. His obsession had taken over, and he was spiraling into a dangerous place she couldn't follow. By mid-October, the tension between them had reached a boiling point. Thomas's behavior became suffocating. He began following Emily wherever she went, appearing outside her school, lingering near their house, always watching, never giving her a moment to breathe. His presence was like a shadow, an ever-present reminder that escape was impossible. Emily felt trapped, her fear growing with each passing day, and the energy to resist drained from her like sand through her fingers. Every glance, every interaction with Thomas now carried the weight of an unspoken threat. She knew, deep down, that if she tried to leave, if she truly pushed him away, Thomas was capable of doing something unthinkable. Then came the night that changed everything. Their parents were at work, and the house was quiet, too quiet. Thomas cornered Emily in her room, locking the door behind him with an eerie sense of finality. His eyes, once so familiar, now held a cold desperation as he demanded they talk, refusing to let her leave until he had said his piece. His words were sharp, laced with accusation. He accused her of betraying him, of planning to abandon him, of leaving him to face the world alone. His voice grew darker, more frantic, as he told her that if she left, if she severed their bond, he wouldn't be able to go on living. Emily backed into the corner of her own room, realized in that moment just how far gone her brother was. That night marked the turning point. Emily's fear solidified into something undeniable, an urgent, gnawing sense that she had to find a way out, and soon. The bond between them, once born of love and shared secrets, had mutated into something twisted, a painful knot of obsession, fear, and manipulation. They were no longer siblings in the true sense, but prisoners to a dangerous connection that neither of them seemed able to break. And yet the deeper they sank into this nightmare, the more they both realized they were hurtling toward disaster. The problem was, neither of them knew how to stop it. November 2023 arrived with its cold winds and short gray days, but the chill between Thomas and Emily was far more unsettling than the changing season. Emily, desperate and isolated, tried to seek help from her friend Lisa. She wanted to confide in someone, to break the silence that had swallowed her whole, but she couldn't bring herself to speak the truth. The weight of her shame, of the dark, tangled emotions that bound her to her brother, was too much. She couldn't explain it, couldn't make anyone understand. And so she retreated even further into herself, avoiding anyone who tried to get close. Her fear of Thomas, her terror of what might happen if anyone found out, kept her silent. Meanwhile, Thomas was making his own plans. He was convinced that he and Emily were destined to be together, that their bond was the only thing that mattered. But with each passing day, he also knew that to secure this future, he might need to take drastic measures. He couldn't let anyone or anything come between them. His obsession, once quietly festering, had now grown into a full-blown delusion. He was prepared to do whatever it took to keep Emily by his side, even if it meant crossing lines he had once sworn he'd never cross. As the tension between them escalated, it was clear that they were drifting further and further from reality. Their once shared world of secrets had become a labyrinth of lies, fear, and desperation. They were lost, trapped in their own emotions, standing on the edge of a precipice with no clear way back. The abyss between them grew deeper, darker, and more dangerous with each passing day. By late November 2023, the storm was no longer brewing, it was here. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and the air between Thomas and Emily was charged with a kind of electric dread. Both knew that something was about to happen, something that would shatter the fragile illusion of control they had been clinging to. They stood on the edge, waiting, knowing that the next step, whoever took it, would plunge them into the darkness for good. And yet, as much as they feared it, neither could stop. The tragedy was already in motion, like a train on a collision course, and all they could do was brace for the impact. The inevitable was coming, and it would leave nothing but destruction in its wake. Under the relentless pressure from Thomas, Emily, worn down by guilt, fear, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness, finally caved. She agreed to his desperate plan to run away, knowing full well that this wasn't an escape. It was a last-ditch effort to outrun the inevitable. Their plan was hastily formed, stitched together by equal parts fear and fantasy, with Thomas convincing her that the only way to preserve their bond was to flee the town and disappear into a place where no one knew them, where they could hide from the prying eyes of judgment, from the consequences of their forbidden love. Thomas, fueled by an increasing obsession, began working out every detail with meticulous care. They would leave everything behind, family, friends, even their phones, ensuring they couldn't be tracked. He outlined the plan over and over in his mind, making sure there would be no traces left behind, no clue as to where they had gone. They would slip away under the cover of night while their parents slept, vanishing before anyone could stop them. But as the night of their escape loomed closer, the tension mounted, every second feeling like it could shatter everything. Emily felt the weight of time pressing down on her, a heavy, suffocating force that made her constantly glance over her shoulder. Every creak in the house, every footstep outside her door sent her heart racing. She was convinced that their secret was on the verge of exposure, that at any moment someone would burst in and confront them. Thomas, on the other hand, grew more aggressive with each passing day. His insistence that they act immediately became a mantra, his obsession tightening around both of them like a vice. In his mind, there was no other option. Every delay, every hesitation was a threat to their survival. And then, the night came. The oppressive silence of the house seemed to amplify their anxiety, the ticking of the clock marking the minutes they had left. They moved in near silence, packing their bags with trembling hands, each item a symbol of the life they were about to abandon. The air between them crackled with tension. They avoided each other's eyes, both consumed by the looming unknown of what lay ahead. Then, without warning, the fragile stillness shattered. A floorboard creaked beneath Thomas's foot, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. In an instant they froze. Before they could react, the door to their room flew open, and there stood Robert, their father, his face twisted in confusion and suspicion. His eyes darted from the suitcases to the backpacks, and a deep, gnawing sense of unease settled in. He knew in that moment that something was terribly wrong. "What's going on here?" Robert demanded, his voice sharp and rising with each word. He stepped closer, his tone growing louder, more urgent. "Why are you packing?" Thomas, gripped by panic, felt his composure slipping. Every second brought him closer to disaster, closer to losing Emily forever. His father's presence, his questions, his looming authority, it was all too much. The desperation inside him reached a fever pitch. He tried to stammer out an excuse, something that would buy them time, but the words wouldn't come. All he could feel was the suffocating fear of losing the only thing that mattered to him, Emily. In that moment, something snapped inside Thomas. A surge of rage, fueled by fear and desperation, overtook him. Without thinking, he lunged at his father, grabbing Robert by the shoulders and shoving him with all the force he could muster. It happened in an instant, a blur of motion and raw emotion. Robert, caught off guard, stumbled backward. Time seemed to slow as his body teetered on the edge of the stairs, arms flailing in a futile attempt to catch himself. And then he fell. The thud of his body hitting the wooden steps reverberated through the house, a sickening sound that seemed to stretch on forever. His head struck the edge of a step with a dull, final crack, and then there was silence. Emily's scream tore through the air, but it was more a rasp, choked by the horror that gripped her. She rushed to her father's side, her heart pounding in her chest, but it was already too late. Robert lay motionless at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, his body twisted in a way that was unmistakable. He was gone. Emily collapsed beside him, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the full weight of what had just happened hit her. The world around her seemed to tilt, spinning out of control. She couldn't process it, couldn't make sense of the chaos that had just unfolded. All she knew was that everything was shattered, irreparably broken. Behind her, Thomas stood frozen, his chest heaving, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. He looked down at what he had done, at his father's lifeless body, and for a moment, the gravity of it didn't seem real. But slowly the reality sank in, and with it, the crushing realization that there was no turning back now. The abyss they had stood on the edge of for so long had finally claimed them, and there was no escaping the fall. Robert lay still, his eyes wide open but drained of life. Emily stood frozen, her gaze locked on her father's lifeless form, unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened. It was as if her entire world had collapsed in a single moment, the solid ground beneath her giving way to a bottomless pit of terror. But panic did not take hold of her. Instead, a cold, primal understanding rose to the surface. There was no going back now. There would be no chance for redemption. She knew instinctively that if they stayed, everything would only get worse. Thomas, still in shock, stood like a statue, his eyes fixed on the body of the man who had been their father. His mind raced but made no connections, his thoughts scattered in the aftermath of his violent outburst. Emily, finding a strength she didn't know she had, grabbed her brother's hand, her grip firm and unrelenting. Her voice shook, but there was a determination behind it, a survival instinct that forced her to act. "We need to go." Thomas, dazed, hesitated, but the urgency in Emily's voice finally reached him. Numbly, he nodded. Together, they gathered the few remaining items they had packed. Suitcases now meaningless, filled with fragments of a life they no longer had, and fled. Behind them, their home, once a sanctuary, was now a tomb of death and chaos. There was no time for goodbyes, no chance to mourn. The night outside was a blanket of cold and darkness. The air clung to their skin like damp fog as they raced through the empty streets, not looking back. Each step felt like running through quicksand, fear pulling at their legs, but they pushed forward, driven by a desperation that knew no logic. Ahead of them lay nothing but uncertainty, a terrifying path that offered no hope, only the knowledge that they had to keep moving. December 10th, 2023. The date seared itself into their minds, the night they became fugitives, leaving behind the only life they'd ever known. With every hurried step, their hearts pounded in unison, their breaths quick and shallow. Springfield, once their home, had become a place of nightmares. The further they ran, the more the weight of what had happened began to bear down on them, a crushing realization that there would be no coming back from this. They were outlaws now, lost, guilty, and alone. As the hours passed and they put more distance between themselves and the scene of the tragedy, paranoia set in, creeping into every corner of their minds. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow seemed to move. Thomas and Emily found themselves unable to even fully trust each other. With each glance, doubt festered between them. They could feel the eyes of the world upon them, always watching, always closing in. They avoided crowded places, too afraid to be recognized. They stuck to dark alleys and back roads, slipping in and out of shadows like phantoms. But their fear only grew stronger, sharper. Every passerby seemed to hold the potential for disaster, every stranger's gaze a threat. They became fugitives not only from the law but from their own minds, tormented by the guilt that gnawed at them with every passing minute. What began as a frantic escape soon turned into a nightmare without end. Days blurred into one another as they wandered through unfamiliar towns, walking nameless roads that seemed to stretch on forever. They spent nights in dingy, anonymous motels, the air thick with the stale scent of fear. Their world, once grounded in a semblance of reality, began to warp under the relentless pressure of horror and paranoia. For Emily, the descent into madness was subtle at first. She noticed strange things creeping into her consciousness, small flickers of movement in the corners of her vision, fleeting but undeniable. The shadows felt darker, the silence heavier. But as the days turned into a blur, these moments grew sharper, more vivid. The horrific visions haunted her at all hours, invading her thoughts, her dreams. It was as if the tragedy they had left behind was following them, twisting itself into grotesque shapes that hovered at the edges of her mind. She couldn't escape the images of her father, the sound of his body falling, the cold, lifeless look in his eyes. She began to lose track of time, of reality itself. Each day was a struggle to hold on to her sanity, and each night was a battle against the nightmares that consumed her. Thomas, too, was unraveling, but in a different way. His guilt had turned inward, transforming into a seething rage that simmered just beneath the surface. He blamed the world, fate, everyone and everything but himself for what had happened. And in those quiet moments, when the silence between them stretched too long, the tension between him and Emily became palpable. They were no longer just running from the consequences of their actions. They were running from themselves. The guilt, the fear, the horror, it was all too much. The weight of their secret, the enormity of what they had done, pressed down on them like a boulder they could never hope to lift. And as they continued their desperate flight into the unknown, the line between reality and nightmare began to blur beyond recognition. They no longer knew where they were going, nor did they have any idea how to escape the darkness that clung to them. Their lives had become a twisted reflection of the secret they had tried so hard to hide, a secret that was now consuming them both, piece by piece, as they ran from a fate they could never truly escape. The scene of her father's death replayed endlessly in Emily's mind, a grotesque loop she couldn't escape. She saw his body again and again, crumpled at the base of the stairs, blood pooling around him in a slow, creeping tide that seemed to have a life of its own. The visions became more vivid with each passing day until they morphed into full-blown hallucinations. Her father's body would rise, his eyes wide and dead, his outstretched hand reaching toward her. His mouth didn't move, but she could feel the accusations, his silent curse stabbing into her soul. Thomas, too, had descended into madness. He heard their father's voice, stern and full of condemnation, reverberating in his mind. The voice grew louder, more insistent, a constant presence that never left him. It called him a traitor, a murderer, telling him that the life he and Emily now led was a just punishment for their sins. He tried to resist it, to drown it out with fleeting distractions, but the voice was relentless. It consumed him, and soon he couldn't tell where reality ended, and the nightmare began. The siblings, once so close, were now trapped in a vortex of paranoia and guilt, an endless spiral of terror that seemed to have no bottom. They stopped trusting each other, their bond poisoned by suspicion. Every glance, every movement carried an unspoken threat. Emily retreated further into herself, folding inwards like a dying flower, while Thomas began losing his grip on his emotions entirely. He spiraled into a pit of despair and self-destruction, his once determined composure crumbling into fragments. Their physical state mirrored the decay of their minds. Days bled into nights without sleep, the constant fear of being caught driving them to the edge of exhaustion. They could barely eat, could hardly think of anything beyond the terror that stalked them with every step. Thomas grew gaunt, his once strong frame now wasted, his face hollowed out, his eyes sunken and lifeless. Emily, too, was a shadow of the girl she had once been. Her face, once bright and full of life, was now pale, her eyes ringed with deep dark circles. Every movement, every breath seemed like an effort she could barely muster, as if she were teetering on the brink of a nervous breakdown. With each passing day, their escape became more chaotic, more desperate. They moved from place to place, always trying to put distance between themselves and the scene of their crime. But it didn't matter. The horror clung to them, followed them like a shadow. Each night they woke drenched in cold sweat, the sound of screams echoing in their minds, seeing ghostly figures lurking in the dark. Their minds were torn between the overwhelming urge to end it all and the paralyzing fear of the reckoning that they knew was coming. It was a brutal existence where every new day brought only more suffering, and their lives had devolved into an endless nightmare. By December 20th, 2023, the nightmare reached its inevitable, tragic conclusion. After weeks of futile attempts to stay hidden, Thomas and Emily found refuge in an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town. The house, long deserted and left to decay, became their final sanctuary, the place where the last remnants of their fragile mental state finally gave way. The walls, once a refuge, became a prison of their own making, the silence inside heavy with their shared guilt and fear. While they spiraled deeper into despair, Detective Linda Morris, a woman known for her sharp instincts and tireless pursuit of justice, had been quietly closing in on them. She had been following their trail for weeks, piecing together their route through scattered surveillance footage and witness statements, slowly unraveling the path they had taken. She had tracked them across towns, through back roads, following every lead with the precision of a hunter closing in on her prey. And now, she was just a breath away from bringing their story to its final, tragic end. As Thomas and Emily huddled inside the decaying house, unaware of how close the reckoning was, the weight of their sins bore down on them, suffocating them in their isolation. The hallucinations, the nightmares, the ever-present guilt, it all reached a fever pitch. The abandoned house that had been their shelter now became a stage for the final act of their unraveling, and they could no longer outrun the horror that had chased them for so long. Thomas and Emily, shattered by the weight of their guilt and haunted by the horrors they had unleashed, didn't expect the police to find them so quickly. When Detective Linda Morris and her team of officers arrived at the decaying house, they left the siblings no chance for escape. The police surrounded the building, guns drawn, their voices cutting through the silence of the night. Yet Thomas and Emily didn't run, didn't hide. It was as if the will to live had already drained out of them, leaving nothing but hollow shells of who they once were. As Morris entered the house, Emily's composure disintegrated completely. The moment she saw the detective, she broke into hysterics, her voice rising in wild, incoherent screams. She begged, pleaded to be left alone, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. She tried to explain that they were innocent, that everything was a terrible misunderstanding, but her voice was fractured by despair and fear. Her hands shook, her body trembling with the weight of emotion she couldn't control. The officers exchanged glances. This was no misunderstanding. The scene unfolding before them was the tragic conclusion of a nightmare they had been chasing for weeks. Thomas, in stark contrast, seemed numb to it all. He sat on the cold, dusty floor, completely unresponsive to the chaos around him. Emily's cries, the commands from the police, it all washed over him like distant echoes. His gaze was vacant, staring at nothing in particular. His mind, broken by the weight of his actions, had already surrendered. When the officers moved to lift him from the floor, placing handcuffs on his wrists, he didn't resist. He barely reacted at all. As they led him out of the house, a single tear slid down his pale cheek. In that brief moment, he met Linda Morris's eyes, and it was clear. He knew this was the end. After the arrest, the police searched the house thoroughly. In one of the dusty, forgotten rooms, hidden beneath a pile of old furniture, they found a small wooden box. Inside, they discovered the evidence that would later unravel the full depth of Thomas and Emily's tragic spiral. Diaries and letters exchanged between the siblings over the past several months. These writings became the key to understanding the dark world in which they had lived, revealing the tortured emotions and forbidden love that had driven them to the brink of destruction. Emily's diary was filled with entries about her internal struggles, the unbearable guilt that consumed her day after day, and the overwhelming fear that their love would lead them both to ruin. She wrote of how each day felt like an endless trial, how she had tried, again and again, to find a way out of the impossible situation. But no matter how hard she fought it, her feelings for her brother overpowered her. Her letters to Thomas, written with a mix of passion and hopelessness, reflected her helplessness. She knew their love was wrong, that it was leading them down a dangerous path, but she couldn't bring herself to sever the bond. Thomas's writings, on the other hand, were a testament to his growing obsession with Emily. His diary was a dark record of his descent into madness, chronicling the intensity of his feelings, his fierce jealousy of anyone who might come close to her. In his letters, he wrote of their unbreakable bond, lacing his words with threats and twisted promises. He believed that they were bound together by something unique, something no one else could understand. His conviction that they couldn't live without each other consumed him, driving him to the edge of reason. These writings were more than just the ramblings of two broken souls. They were the final proof that their love had transformed into something far darker and more dangerous. The diaries and letters, once private confessions of their forbidden emotions, became the linchpin in the case against them. They left no doubt that Thomas and Emily were fully aware they were heading toward catastrophe, yet they were unable or unwilling to stop themselves. When these documents were presented in court, they painted a damning picture. The words on those pages were raw and unfiltered, exposing the twisted reality the siblings had lived in for months. Emily's despair, Thomas's obsession, their shared knowledge that their love was a ticking time bomb, all of it was laid bare before the jury. There was no escaping the truth. The diaries, filled with the agonizing details of their descent into madness, became the decisive factor in the court's verdict. The evidence was overwhelming. In the end, the court could not ignore the darkness that had consumed Thomas and Emily. Their tragic story, once hidden in the shadows, was now a matter of public record, a cautionary tale of how love, when twisted by obsession and guilt, could lead two people down a path of destruction from which there was no escape. The revelation of Thomas and Emily's diaries shattered the carefully constructed illusion of the Bennett family's perfection. What had once been the pride of Springfield, a model family in a quiet town, was now a symbol of horror, their darkest secrets exposed to the world. The diaries laid bare the power of unchecked emotions, the devastating consequences of internal conflicts that could twist even the closest of bonds into something monstrous. Their lives had become a nightmare, one from which there was no escape. On March 25, 2024, the trial reached its harrowing conclusion. The judge, somber and deliberate, delivered the verdict that would forever mark Springfield's history. Thomas and Emily Bennett were found guilty of the murder of their father, Robert Bennett. The courtroom, which had seen weeks of agonizing testimony, expert psychological evaluations, and painful confessions, fell into a heavy silence. The defense had fought hard, arguing that Thomas and Emily's fragile mental states, shattered by the weight of their forbidden relationship, should mitigate their punishment. Expert witnesses presented evidence of their deep psychological scars, their descent into madness, and the emotional turbulence that had led to Robert's death. But the judge, while acknowledging their broken minds, could not ignore the brutality of the crime, nor the chilling premeditation evident in the siblings' actions. No justification, no emotional plea could excuse what they had done in the eyes of the law or society. Thomas was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years, but only under strict psychiatric supervision for the remainder of his life. His role in the murder, The violence of the act was deemed central to the tragedy. Emily, whose involvement was seen as complicit but under duress, was sentenced to 20 years, with the possibility of parole after 15 years, provided she also received mandatory psychiatric treatment throughout her sentence. The justice system weighed their mental instability against the crime, but the outcome was inevitable. They would both spend decades paying for the life they had destroyed. On the day of the sentencing, the courtroom was thick with an eerie stillness. The crowd watched in silence as the judge spoke the final words that sealed their fate. Emily, pale and trembling, wept silently, tears tracing cold paths down her cheeks. She did not speak, her voice swallowed by the immense weight of her guilt and grief. She knew, as those words were spoken, that everything was lost. Her brother, her family, her freedom, and perhaps even her own soul. Thomas, on the other hand, seemed emotionally vacant, detached from the reality unfolding around him. His face, expressionless and cold, betrayed nothing, but inside he too felt the storm of emotions tearing him apart. He had lost the person he had once believed he could not live without, and now, in his final defeat, there was nothing left but emptiness. After the trial, Springfield was irrevocably changed. The Bennett's once beautiful, prosperous home became a monument to destruction, a grim reminder of the nightmare that had unfolded within its walls. The townspeople, shaken and horrified by the tragedy, began avoiding even speaking of it. It was as if the very mention of the Bennett family might awaken something dark and dangerous, a shadow that had settled over the town. What had once been a peaceful place now carried an undercurrent of fear, a lingering unease that no one could quite shake. Whispers began to spread, rumors that the Bennett house was cursed, that the madness that had destroyed the family still lingered within its crumbling walls. Some claimed to hear strange sounds at night, soft whispers or faint footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. Others swore they saw shadows moving behind the windows, even though the house had long since been abandoned. These local legends grew in the months that followed, turning the Bennett home into a place of dread. The tragedy had left its mark, not just on the family, but on the very foundation of the town itself. People began to avoid the house, fearing the stories and the curse that seemed to cling to it. It became a ghostly reminder of how deeply the Bennett tragedy had scarred Springfield. The once proud symbol of peace and prosperity was now a haunted relic, standing as a testament to the darkness that had consumed an entire family. Some believed that anyone who dared to enter the house might encounter the same madness that had destroyed the Bennetts, that the house had absorbed their despair and terror, and now radiated it back into the world like a poison. As the years passed, the Bennett tragedy faded into legend, a ghost story passed down by those too young to remember the real events. But for those who had lived through it, who had seen the perfect family unravel before their eyes, the nightmare was always there, just beneath the surface of their quiet town. The shadow of what had happened never truly left Springfield, and the once bright future of the Bennett family was now a warning, a reminder of how love, when twisted by obsession and fear, could lead even the closest of people to ruin. Robert Bennett's once thriving construction business shut down not long after the trial. His partners, eager to distance themselves from the shadow of the tragedy, quietly dissolved their ties, leaving the memory of their partnership buried in the past. No one in Springfield wanted to be associated with the name Bennett anymore, as if merely mentioning it could invoke the same darkness that had consumed the family. Sarah Bennett, the mother of Thomas and Emily, had been reeling in shock since the night of her husband's death. After the verdict, she was found in her bedroom in a near catatonic state, unable to comprehend the devastation that had torn her family apart. She was hospitalized, placed in isolation to protect her fragile mind from the harsh reality outside. Sarah remained disconnected from the world for a long time, a ghost of her former self, lost in the echoing chambers of grief and disbelief. The town, fearful of being touched by the tragedy's curse, avoided discussing the Bennett family at all costs. Even her name, once respected and loved, became something to fear. A cloud of paranoia settled over Springfield in the aftermath of the trial. People whispered behind closed doors, fearing that the darkness that had befallen the Bennetts could seep into their own lives. Suspicion hung in the air like a low fog, thick and pervasive. Conversations about the tragedy dried up, as if speaking of it might somehow invite the same misfortune into their homes. The Bennett name became something to be feared, a symbol of the unknown horrors that could lie just beneath the surface of everyday life. After their sentencing, Thomas and Emily were sent to different prisons, separated not only by bars but by the unbearable weight of their shared past. The siblings, once inseparable, were now isolated from each other, condemned to a life where the only companionship they had was the torment of their own memories. For them, life became an endless nightmare. In her solitary cell, Emily was haunted by the same recurring visions. Night after night, she relived the moment of her father's death, watching him fall again and again, hearing the sickening crack of his skull hitting the stairs. Her nightmares twisted into waking hallucinations, making it impossible for her to escape the horror, even in the light of day. Emily's mental state deteriorated rapidly. She withdrew from everyone around her, refusing to speak to prison psychologists or engage with anyone who tried to help. She became a shell of her former self, living in silence except for the letters she wrote to Thomas, letters she never had the courage to send. In them, she begged for his forgiveness, even as she forgave him in return, her words filled with sorrow and longing for a brother she could no longer reach. Thomas, confined to his own prison, found no relief either. His days were filled with the echoes of his father's voice, accusing him, berating him for destroying their family. The hallucinations that had started as whispers in the back of his mind now dominated his life. He argued with his father's ghost, speaking aloud to someone no one else could see, his voice rising in desperation. Other inmates avoided him, unnerved by his constant conversations with the dead, his vacant gaze as he slipped further and further into madness. Thomas, once the confident and determined brother, had become a man trapped in an endless spiral of guilt and self-destruction. Springfield, the quiet town that had once been the epitome of peace and prosperity, never truly recovered from the tragedy. The story of the Bennett family became entrenched in local folklore, passed down from generation to generation like a grim cautionary tale. It served as a warning to anyone who dared to break taboos or bury dark secrets beneath the surface. The legend of the cursed Bennett house spread far and wide, growing with each retelling. People spoke of strange sounds in the night, of ghostly figures glimpsed in the windows of the abandoned house. Children dared one another to step inside, but few had the courage to do so. The house, once a home filled with life, had become a haunted monument to the destruction that unchecked obsession could cause. The townspeople stopped speaking of the Bennett tragedy aloud, but its shadow never left. It lingered, heavy and unspoken, over the lives of everyone in Springfield. While the town eventually returned to its daily routine, shops opened, children went to school, and the seasons changed, there was always a sense that something dark lurked beneath the surface. Everyone knew, in the deepest corners of their hearts, that the horror that had unfolded could return. It was a reminder of how fragile peace could be, how easily the darkness inside us all could rise up and consume everything. The Bennett story would forever be etched into Springfield's history, a tale of love turned into obsession, of secrets festering into madness, and of the terrible price paid when darkness is allowed to flourish unchecked.